Welcome to the Friday edition of One's World, and you can see here I've got a pot boiling. It's got master stock in it, and no, I'm not going to do more cooking today, except to start off by saying that here I have put new aromatics into my pot. What you have to do weekly maybe is strain the broth, take out all the old used up aromatics and put new ones in, so that as you add some new water or maybe some stock of pork bones maybe, or chicken bones or fish bones if you have it, but if you don't, then you just have to make do with water and just some boiling away. And so I don't know how long I'm going to keep up this particular master stock, probably for another week or two, but it's a good segue into my topic for today, which concerns ideas. Where do ideas come from? Well, let's think about that. So, over the course of my career, which ostensibly starts in the late 60s, early 70s, so I've been at this for a very long time now, over 50 years. And when I first started teaching domestication, we taught that there were 5 basic centers of the domestication of plants and animals. They were the oldest being Mesopotamia and the Fertile Crescent, the area around what was once Babylon, between the Tigris and the Euphrates, the Indus Valley in northern India, central China, particularly around the Yangtze River, Mesopotamia, what is now Mexico, particularly the Oaxaca Valley, and the southern Andes in the region of what is now Peru. And those 5 basic centers were the cradles of individual civilizations, so that Mesopotamia, for example, gave rise to various empires, including the Assyrian, Babylonian, later the Persian, that there were various empires in central China, in northern India, and the Aztec Empire in Mexico, and the Inca Empire in Peru. And it all just seemed like a fairly straightforward cultural evolution, that humans started off as hunters and gatherers, what we now call foragers, because there's more to hunting than just shooting animals. I mean, there's fishing and other ways of getting protein. So we call them foragers. And that there was a transition from foraging to domesticated plants and animals at some stage, which we now peg at somewhere between 12 to 10,000 years ago, depending on where we're looking. And it's always been an open question as to why people moved from foraging to domestication. And in hindsight, if you're not thinking about it, if you're an Enlightenment philosopher like Jean-Jacques Rousseau or Thomas Hobbes, then your idea will be, well, it's an improvement. Foraging is uncertain. The famous quote of life in the state of nature being nasty, brutal, and short. Well, it's just not true. And in the 1960s, Robert Bourget-Lee, among others, Marshall Salins, demonstrated that foragers have a much better life than farmers. They don't have to do as much work in order to get their food. And it ought to be obvious. They don't have to plant, they don't have to irrigate, they don't have to weed, they don't have to do anything except harvest. Every day they go out to collect nuts or greens or fruit or whatever. Takes them very little time. The estimate is something like 1 or 2 hours a day, and that's it. Whereas a farmer has to make sure that the ground is fertilized and hoed or plowed, has to keep it moist, has to protect the plants from insects and various pests and diseases, and has to be sure that something catastrophic doesn't happen, like you've got a whole stand of wheat just ready to be ripened and all of a sudden a storm comes along and your whole year's labor is wiped out. Foragers don't have to worry about any of that. And hunters likewise. Hunters just go and hunt wild animals and bring it home. Whereas people who have sheep or goats or pigs or cattle or whatever, they have to keep them safe from the elements. They have to make sure they don't get sick. They have to make sure that people don't come and steal them, and so on. So all around, foraging is a much better deal than planting and herding. You just don't have to do as much work, nowhere near as much work. In fact, we can extend that argument to say that the more technology we have, the more we have to work. Even when I was growing up in the 60s, there was this whole question as to whether there was going to be too much leisure time because mechanization, robots and whatnot were going to put people out of work. So what are they going to do with all of this leisure time? Well, it never happened. It never happened for two reasons. One, because the people who were put out of work were the people who the state could just take care of through unemployment payments and so forth. And they weren't a leisure class. The people who were still working were working harder than ever because they were supporting their technology, which nowadays will include a smartphone, a laptop, maybe you've got a dishwasher, a washing machine. All of that takes money. It takes money to buy the technology, it takes money to buy the maintenance and the extra stuff, like if you've got a washing machine, then you have to have washing detergent, you have to pay for electricity, as well as pay for repairs and so on and so forth. The more you have, the harder you work. So why did people choose domestication when they had it made? And that's not something that anthropologists have got a clear answer to, but we're getting there. The basic idea is that domestication would never have happened unless people were forced into the situation. And there are various possibilities, such as population increase, although archaeologically that does not seem to be the case. It seems to be the opposite way round, that during periods of foraging, populations remain stable, but once people become sedentary farmers, their populations increase. And one of the reasons their populations increase is because they have to do more work, and so they need more labor, and that means having more children. And so it snowballs in an exponential fashion. So another possibility is that people were forced, because their resources were getting fewer and fewer, that there were not as many plants to forage, not as many animals to hunt, and so they had to do something about it. That, in some ways, is more likely, and it's also more likely that it happened because of climate change. And there was a key climate change around the end of the Pleistocene, the end of the glacial period, into what's called the Holocene, as the modern period, that temperatures increased, various plants and animals changed or died or what have you, and there was a need to find new resources. But here's the thing. It didn't happen all of a sudden. And it certainly didn't happen because somebody had a bright idea. Oh, if I plant a seed, it will grow and I can have it whenever I want. That didn't happen because people knew how seeds worked. They knew how grasses grew stalks with seeds on them, and when they were ripe, the wind blew the seeds all around. They knew that. And it was actually one of their slight problems, because people before domestication collected wild grasses. But the thing is that if you're using stone tools to collect wild grass, you can imagine that when you strike at the stalks to cut them off so that you can harvest the seed's going to scatter, because that's how the plant is designed. It's designed to mature to the point where when a good wind blows, the seeds blow off. The thing that holds the seed to the stem is called a rachis or a rachis. And in wild grasses, the rachis is very brittle, so that it breaks very easily. Now, if you're a Paleolithic stone tool using forager, and you're banging all these stalks with stone tools, most of the seeds are going to be lost. But not if the plant has a strong rachis that keeps the seed tied to the stem. Now, that's not functional for the grass, but it's good for you, because when you cut the stem, you get all of the seeds. But then you have to plant them yourself in order to get a new crop. And that may be one of the ways in which domestication occurred, that it is a simple selection of grasses with strong rachis, binding the seeds to the stem. You collect them very efficiently, but then you have to plant them. Now, two things I find really quite fascinating. One of them is that this process did not just happen overnight. It wasn't like foraging resources were drying up and so people just immediately turned to planting. Archaeological evidence strongly suggests that it took about 3,000 years for foragers in Mesopotamia, where wheat, barley, rye, oats, and so forth were domesticated from wild grasses. 3,000 years. That was a very slow process. And it wasn't a matter of just, okay, now I've got these seeds, I'm going to plant them in the ground. There were a series of experiments with where to plant, how to plant. There's some evidence that riverside communities annually, when the rivers flooded and then receded and left alluvial plains, that the alluvium had been washed down the river to the slower basins or deltas, and that people would then take their seeds and scatter them in the alluvium, and that continued for some time, and then other forms of domestication developed. That's one, that it took a long time. And the second point, which almost never gets put into the textbooks but is also very important, is to ask who were the ones who were doing the experimenting. Well, when you look at typical temperate zone foragers, it is primarily the men who do the hunting and primarily the women who do the foraging. For numerous reasons. One of them is that foraging can be done with small children in tow. You can carry a child, an infant, on your back, go out into the woods or the grasslands and do all of your collecting and return home. Whereas it's much more difficult to hunt that way. And also that on average, men are stronger or the upper body at least, than women. And so the division of labor between hunting primarily by men and foraging primarily by women is a very old division of labor. So who's going to experiment with the domestication of plants when the need arises? It's going to be women, because women know the biology of food plants. They have that knowledge that they've stored up from centuries of foraging. So when it comes to planting and experimenting with different modes of planting and harvesting, it's going to be the women. And it seems quite likely, based on what we know about different agricultural and farming techniques in the relatively modern world, that women have dominated planting of seeds most of human history. The time when men take over agriculture is with the invention of the plow. When all of planting was done by what means we call horticulture, normally what would happen is that a particular area would be cleared and the brush and trees would be burned, and then the seeds planted using a hoe in the ashes, where the ash acts as the fertilizer. That's a very common horticultural pattern throughout the world. So that means that women dominate that activity because they know plant biology. The clearing is normally done by men, and the burning, and then when that's done, the women take over. They do the planting, the weeding, the caring, watering, harvesting. But when the plow was invented and plow agriculture took over from slash and burn horticulture, then men took over because it's more physically strenuous work. So let's go back to my original question. Where do ideas come from? Well, it's just not a simple matter. It's not a matter of people waking up one day and saying, oh, I've got an idea. I'll plant some seeds, or I'll take wild boars and turn them into domesticated pigs, or I'll take wild sheep and goats and turn them into domestic sheep and goats, and so forth. That's not how things work. What happens is that people are put under stress and they have to come up with ideas. And Linus Pauling, a Nobel Prize winner, is famous for answering the question, how do you have so many good ideas? And Linus Pauling replied, I have a lot of ideas and throw out the bad ones. Well, that's actually a pretty good answer. And it's also most likely what was happening in the world of domestication, that they were having a lot of ideas, and some of them worked and some of them didn't. And the ideas that worked, they built on over time until eventually they came up with a solution that was going to work for long periods of time. And it involved a lot of different variables. It involved, for example, with the domestication of cereals, it involved changes in the genetic makeup of the cereals. It involved people adapting their strategies of planting in different ways, from alluvial soils to slash and burn fields and so forth. So it happened incrementally over a long period of time. It wasn't sudden, but it had dramatic effects on the way that people lived. And that's also something I'm writing about right now, because once you have domesticated cereals like wheat, barley, and in China rice and millet, or in South America, Mesoamerica, maize, then you can store it. You can store wheat for a very long time, and barley and rice and so forth. And when you can store things for a very long time, other people can get ideas, like they can decide they're going to steal what you've stored, or they're going to tax what you've stored. And so you get a whole different social organization. You may end up with a state formation that has an army, and the army has a duty of protecting the resources of the upper class, who tax the lower class in order to satisfy their lifestyle, and so it goes. So it's a complex system of development over time. It's not like somebody has a bright idea, oh, I want to be king, or I want to plant seeds, or whatever. It's a slowly maturing process over a long period of time. And that's what we all need to contemplate. Not just, am I going to have a bright idea today, but am I going to keep working on ideas day after day after day? And one of the ways I do it is to write and to make videos, because the more I talk, the more I think. The more I think, the more my ideas develop, and so it goes. So that's one idea about ideas. So I hope you have a jolly good weekend. I'll be back on Tuesday, maybe with the recipe, not sure. Maybe some thoughts about carnival, also not sure. But have a wonderful weekend.